Hello, you're watching the press preview. A first look at the front pages as they come into us here. It's time to see what's making the headlines with political editor at the Daily Mirror, Pippa Crerar, and editor at the Politico London Playbook, Alex Wickham. They'll be joining us in a moment and will be with us until just before midnight. So let's take a look then at some of those front pages for you. We're going to start off with the Metro. Goes with images of the chaos at Kabul airport today as people clung to the side of planes. The FT also leads with a picture of the scenes at the airport as people ran alongside that US Air Force plane. Hundreds of people are on crammed jets, is the Mirror's splash, the headline desperate. The race to escape Kabul is also on the front of the Times, which says hundreds of Britons and Afghan interpreters are still trying to flee the country. Here's your Daily Telegraph, writing about Joe Biden's defiant message in his speech tonight, standing by his decision, of course, to pull US troops from Afghanistan. The Sun's headline reads, "Joke Biden," and says the US president was surprised at the speed with which the Taliban advanced. The Guardian says it was reported that Joe Biden was anxious to avoid a situation similar to the hurried US withdrawal from Saigon at the end of the Vietnam War. And the Yorkshire Post telling more of that story at the airport, showing what appears to be people scaling the wall at Hamid Karzai International Airport. And I'm joined tonight by the political editor at the Daily Mirror, Pippa Crerar, and editor at the Politico London Playbook, Alex Wickham. Great to see you both after what has been a desperately sad and depressing 24 hours, well, 48 hours, really. Pippa, why don't we start with you? Front page of The Guardian, chaos in Kabul as thousands struggle to flee the Taliban. And that image, which we've been watching all day, terrifying image, repeated on most of the front pages. And it really does feel like that will be the defining image, doesn't it, of this US withdrawal?
It really does. I mean, we're asked by President Biden not to make parallels with Vietnam, and that very striking image, which we all remember, about the helicopter jetting, taking off from the US embassy in Saigon, the last few diplomats as the Americans fled Vietnam and lost the war. Yet it's very hard to get away from that feeling that something similar is happening here with Afghanistan. And those images today, so striking from Kabul airport. I mean, I watched a video earlier, like many people, of a plane taking off and was stunned by the number of people on the runway who'd broken through the barricades and were on the tarmac, desperately clinging to wheels and the sort of the chassis, the underside of the aeroplane as it took off. And the first video clip I saw stopped just before, I think it was this one actually showing now. It wasn't clear whether it was landing or whether it was taking off. And then somebody pointed out to me that actually it was on its way up into the air. And subsequently, these awful videos emerged of people, some of those men probably, who'd been clinging to the plane, falling down. And we understand that a couple lost their lives. The chaos that those scenes represented probably replicated across the rest of the country. I mean, it's very difficult for journalists to get into some parts of Afghanistan at the moment, but it was truly depressing. And I think all of the front pages managed to get across that very human fear and anxiety that is being played out amongst the Afghan people about their future and what will happen now that the Taliban are in charge.
Yeah, Alex, and we'll talk about President Biden's speech in a moment, but just sticking with that image, today we heard from the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and he got very emotional in one interview, didn't he? Because he said that some people, like some of those, I'm sure, running along the tarmac, won't get out. They won't make it to the US or indeed to the UK.
Exactly, and that is the sort of unbearable truth that Britain and America is having to face up to tonight. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, a former soldier himself, feels extremely personally about this issue, and I think that came across in quite a way that perhaps we wouldn't have imagined. A Defence Secretary, traditionally a sort of a tough guy, and not to say Ben Wallace isn't a tough guy, but really, to show that emotion really just shows the level of upset, but also anger, I think, tonight in the British government as to how this has developed in the last 24, 48 hours. I think it was always on the cards that America very clearly wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan. It wanted to hand over somehow. It didn't feel that it needed to have a third decade of troops in this country. But it's the way that President Biden has done this tonight that I think has upset not just people watching these images across the world, but also America's closest allies, the British government, as I think we will find over the coming days. Will it be starting to express, and Ben Wallace was starting to do it this morning, just that real quite more than frustration. It's rage and fury, to be honest.
But should we be frustrated, Alex, as well? I mean, the Prime Minister said in the last day or so, we've known for a long time the way things were going. But at the start of July, he said there's no military path to victory for the Taliban. So he clearly didn't know how things were going to pan out.
Well, this is a really fascinating point that will be argued over the next few days. I mean, it's interesting to see that the EU leaders actually, back in July, urged the American government to just do this carefully, to be wary, because it was possible that the Taliban could quickly make gains. So if the EU leaders were sort of warning the Americans and that this was a possibility, you would have thought that the intelligence wasn't just a complete failure. It wasn't just a case of the US intelligence advising the president, oh, it'll all be fine. Clearly there were conflicting views. Clearly there were doubts, and we've heard tonight from the President Biden and from the White House that actually it was never impossible for the Taliban to take over. This was always a possibility. Well, that seems a very different line from what we were hearing from President Biden literally just a few weeks ago, where he was spinning his decision as, don't worry about it, everything's going to be great, no way that anything could possibly go wrong. Well, it really has, and that's going to come down pretty badly on the president over the next few weeks, months and years.
Yeah, on July the 8th, he said the likelihood there's going to be the Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country is highly unlikely. OK, Pippa, let's look at the front of the Daily Telegraph then, talk a bit more about Biden's speech this evening, because he was defiant, wasn't he, in that speech? He was unrepentant about his decision, and it felt to me that it was a speech very much squarely aimed at the American public, who we know from polls were ready for their troops to come home.
Yes, and we shouldn't really be surprised by that, because President Biden was elected on a promise to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. Obviously, the process was begun in the Doha talks or agreed by in the Doha talks eventually, but it was begun by Donald Trump when he was president, and Joe Biden made clear that he would carry on with that plan for withdrawal. I mean, it would have been very tricky politically to have gone back on that and to have said at the last minute, actually, I don't agree, now's not the time to withdraw. However, Joe Biden tonight really seemed to present it as a binary choice between either total withdrawal or staying in the numbers, troops in the numbers that they had been in Afghanistan up until this point. And I think many people would argue that actually it didn't need to be a binary choice. As Alex has already said, it was about how the withdrawal took place, and that could have been done in a much more cautious, measured way. Joe Biden was very defiant tonight. I mean, he said he stuck squarely behind his decision. He cast the blame not just at Donald Trump, but also very scathingly at the Afghan leadership, the fact that they had fled and left their country, and sort of posed the question, one imagines mostly to a domestic audience, how many more of our American daughters and sons do you think it's worth sending over to Afghanistan to fight, when even the Afghan fighters themselves are not prepared to do so? Now, you could say that actually the two things are linked, and one of the main reasons why the Afghan army crumbled is because of the incredible collapse in morale that came about because the Americans had withdrawn so quickly, and they didn't have the backup, they didn't have the air power, they didn't have the crack troops supporting them. They didn't have one of the world's biggest superpower having their back anymore, and that it was inevitable that this would happen. I mean, the only sort of indication that Joe Biden gave of that he may have, if not got it wrong, then at least not predicted all of this, was when he said that he admitted this Taliban sweep had happened more quickly than they'd anticipated. But it's very hard to see how American intelligence failed so dramatically that they weren't able to give them any heads up that was likely to happen.
Yeah, I mean, he did also say, didn't he, that the buck stops with him. Sorry to interrupt, Pippa. I just want to get Alex's thoughts on the front of the Sun. I mean, is that a fair headline, do you think? Joke Biden?
Well, I mean, I think it's a headline that a lot of people in the sort of foreign policy establishment, which is traditionally pretty sympathetic to the U.S. government, would share tonight. I mean, I've seen articles being written and published in the last few hours from really respected American foreign policy think tank people like Shady Hamid from the Brookings Institute, saying that this is Biden's America First strategy, which is obviously the slogan used by Donald Trump to talk about his sort of isolationist and inward-looking policies. And now we're seeing that applied to a Democrat leader, the man who was supposed to, show the world that, quote, America is back. That's what Biden was telling everyone at the G7 in Cornwall earlier this year. Well, now he's been criticised by people who would traditionally be sympathetic to his worldview, now as a sort of Trump-like America First style politician, which is really an extraordinary change in fortunes from someone who, much of the media was so relieved to see, become president over last year.
OK, we must leave it there for the moment. Pippa, Alex, thank you. Speak in a moment. Coming up, plenty more from the papers. Hello again, Pippa and Alex still with us. Front page of the Daily Telegraph, Alex. Homeowners face higher energy bills to pay for greener gas. What's this all about?
Yeah, so this is a proposal from the government tonight as part of its so-called hydrogen strategy for Britain, which is to basically slap a subsidy on energy bills for homeowners in order to pay for greener gas, hydrogen gas, which the government wants to fund around 10% of homes going forward. And the Telegraph has gone with a pretty critical angle of this policy so far, saying basically it's a lot of money. It's a subsidy on working people up and down the country, and it only pays for 10%, which is a pretty small niche number of homes' energy. But this just sums up, I think, the problem that the government have on ahead of this its COP summit over in November, as it tries to sort of come up with some sort of world-leading, as they always say, policy on climate change. All of these policies are going to be very expensive. All these policies are going to get a lot of criticism from the Conservatives' usual supporters, whether it's in the media or even in their own party. And basically they can't come up with an idea that will gain the support of the Telegraph, of Tory backbenchers, just because they all cost so much money. And when you see other countries, China, Russia, still emitting vast amounts of carbon, these papers are just always going to ask, is it worth it? And that's the question that the government's still struggling to answer. Yeah, something they're going to have to grapple with. And just sum this up for us in 30 seconds, if you would, Pippa, the story about Prince Andrew in the Metro.
Yes, this is Prince Andrew allegedly going to go for diplomatic immunity in the Virginia Roberts sex abuse case that he's apparently going to face in the States. He was the UK Special Representative for Trade and Investment for a decade after he left the army, you'll remember. And potentially, because he was working for the UK government, would qualify for immunity. It's not because he's a member of the royal family. The suggestions are that his lawyers are desperate for him to avoid facing a jury in the United States because they could potentially side, they believe, with the alleged victim. He, of course, denies these claims, but regardless, using something like diplomatic immunity would look pretty bad in PR terms to the royal family, because it might look like he's trying to escape facing the judicial process and proving his innocence.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. We're out of time, but you did sum that up very nicely for us. Thank you, Pippa, and thank you, Alex.